Now that we've talked a little bit about process, let's pull out a second to the bigger picture and talk about the context and environment surrounding this process. For instance, you might want to work in-house, like client side at a video game company or something like that. You might want to work at an agency. You might want to be at a startup, or perhaps you want to start your own thing altogether. As we go through the course, my goal is to set you up for success in any of those contexts by giving you a solid foundation which you can scale based on where you are and what you're doing. So the goal of this lecture is to do a quick overview of context and how that relates to how you work. And we touched on this a bit earlier, but we're going to dig in more here. So let's talk about people. We don't work in a vacuum, fortunately. That would be very noisy, I bet. We have clients, coworkers, partners, like third-party vendors. Maybe someone else is writing all the content for your project, for instance. There are many different people who can influence our work. And because of that, our work has many audiences, which can include designers, developers, clients, and other business partners. And this is true whether you're at a startup, in-house, at an agency, etc. But people are different, and they have different tastes and interests based on where they're coming from. And when we talk about wireframing later in the course, we'll talk about all the different things those can represent for these different types of people or project stakeholders. But for now, one takeaway here is that wherever you're working, you'll need to communicate with your colleagues or employees in order to make things happen. And when you're communicating, it's important to know where people are coming from and what will be important to that audience, and communicate that in order to achieve success. But there are other factors which are larger than individual people. For instance, your environment. If you're at an agency, it's bigger and there's a lot more collaboration. There's a bigger team, and that requires a more well-defined structure. So where does that team and structure come from? Well, the teams come from departments. But where do the departments come from? Let's look at that first. Agencies do a lot. They represent everything they can do as their capabilities. This is kind of like their resume. Capabilities loosely map to departments. The last agency I was at had 5 main ones. And this is the basic default structure, kind of like the template for a team that you start with. Project type and size will influence how thin or fat this gets. Small projects might not have everyone, and big projects might have some redundancies. Agency structure and process can impose additional context on how we work and affect how we work. So that said, let's move on and talk about a very important aspect of process, deliverables. What we mean by deliverables is the result or output of some of our activities. Deliverables and how they're presented are more important at agencies. In this context, they're an important embodiment of the work we're doing with our clients, as well as a way for our clients to take that work and sell it internally to their colleagues to maintain and increase excitement and buy-in around the project. But you don't deliver everything, because it doesn't really make sense. To use a bad analogy, at a restaurant, you're not paying for all the ingredients, right? You're paying for how they come together. So similarly, the output of every activity we perform isn't always meaningful to clients. We and our clients may know that doing something, like looking at analytics, is valuable and will help us produce great work, but it's not worth sharing the output as an individual deliverable. They're usually looking for the solution to their problem, not part of the solution or an individual item that informed the solution. So you don't package and present everything, and you also don't try to sell everything. Remember all this confusion? You don't want to open this Pandora's box unless you have a clear goal in doing so. Sometimes you do this behind the scenes if you feel like you need to do a little something extra, but it's not always client-facing. This reminds me of a personal litmus test I have when speaking to developers. I find that the most talented and senior developers often have such a good grasp of their craft that they can tell me about what they're doing in plain English, without turning on the fire hose of technobabble, which will most likely go way over my head. Have you noticed that too? But anyway, that's a digression. So back to the subject at hand. What you do deliver often needs to tell the story of how you got to your solution or recommendation. And this storytelling often takes the form of a presentation, which we'll discuss in the next lecture. So let's talk about some takeaways here. Number 1, not all activities produce deliverables. Number 2, not all deliverables are for clients. Some are just for internal use to help the internal team align and maintain momentum and answer questions. And number 3, more specific activities or deliverables often become part of a larger deliverable, which is usually a presentation.